let's see. Very good. It's working. So welcome, everybody. I'll just begin by saying for decades, we've been holding these lectures in person, just down the hall from my office here in the main building on the UPEI campus in Charlottetown. We cover island-related topics from Prince Edward Island and other islands, and have a very wonderful library of many of those recordings on our website. But now with this pivot to online, we're meeting virtually. So it's got the minuses and the pluses. Like the minus, we don't get to see everybody face to face or in person, but on the plus side, we can bring in guest lecturers from anywhere in the world, like today. So I think everybody's turned off cameras and microphones, and please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, because I just want to keep this to be a nice informal session. We've got a wonderful session in store for you this afternoon, but I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Ebequate in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. As we're gathering today on a virtual platform, it is important to respectfully acknowledge the history, spirituality, culture, and rights of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples from coast to coast to coast, who've called this land home since time immemorial, and who continue to experience the ongoing effects of colonialism and systemic racism. And I encourage everyone to consider how we each, in our own way, can actively honor and uphold our treaty obligations in the spirit of true reconciliation. So, for those of you who may not be familiar with the Institute of Island Studies, we are a research, education, and public policy institute based at the University of Prince Edward Island on Canada's Atlantic coast. You can learn more about what we do by checking out our website, islandstudies.com, or through our social media accounts. I'd like to start by telling you how this particular lecture came about. Last year around this time, I was approached by Ilse van Dijk about doing an internship on PEI that would form part of her master's degree in islands and sustainability at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. We talked about her interest in culture and climate change adaptation, trying to come up with a few ideas for an internship. Then, because of the climate change focus, I had the brilliant idea of asking Ross Dwyer to join us. Now, Ross is from the Center for Climate Change and Adaptation, and he had some amazing ideas, and I would like to pass it over to Ross to tell him, ask him if he would pick up on the story.
Sure. Thanks, Laurie. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. It's a thrill to be here. As Laurie said, my name is Ross Dwyer, and I'm currently the Manager of Research Partnerships for the Canadian Centre for Climate Change and Adaptation. And that big mouthful sits somewhere above St. Peter's Bay at the moment and will be opening soon. So when Laurie approached me about this possibility, it was a thrill to be able to partner with Island Studies and to look at specifically climate adaptation and culture within islands. And when Laurie had said that we would be looking at a student or potentially hosting a student from the Netherlands, I was kind of completely blown away, really, and just thrilled that we had that possibility and that connection. One of our programs that we run through the Climate Centre is Climate Sense, which is a project particularly about climate adaptation. And we have a number of interns that worked on the island this summer in specific jobs all over the NGOs and provincial government organizations, and also in terms of professional training. And so we kind of saw this from our side in climate as another internship opportunity to have Ilse on board. When we originally received the funding from Natural Resources Canada to do this work, it was to look at what they called the professions, right? So architecture, engineering, and things like that. And one of our goals here at UPEI was to broaden that definition of professionals and include artists and cultural professionals in that work. And so when Laurie and myself and Ilse had started chatting about these possibilities, it turned into a great opportunity to explore this area of climate and climate's touch on art and culture a bit more closely. So as I say, thanks to Natural Resources Canada for the funding, and to the Climate Sense project for being able to play a part in this, and just thrilled again, you know, the center is there hopefully for the community and for everybody, and we really like to keep our relationship strong with the Masters of Island Studies program. So over to Laurie, and congratulations in advance to Ilse. I know this is going to be great.
Thanks so much, Ross. And it's so good to, I'm so glad that you're there doing the work that you're doing. And Ross is also a student in our Master of Arts and Island Studies program. So it was great to connect with him on that front as well. So between the two of us, after we had a couple of meetings over coffee, we were able to come up with a list of artists and organizations for Ilse, and then have some Zoom calls with her in order to, you know, flesh out the project proposal. And after that, we were able to help facilitate her ethics submission to the UPEI Research Ethics Board with help from Megan Lane McDonald, who's also on the call today. And she too is a student in our Master of Arts and Island Studies program and editor of our monthly newsletter, Island Studies News, and organizer of this event. And unfortunately, in the end, I know Ilse was disappointed that she wasn't able to travel to PEI, but we used technology, all of us, to she was able to meet the artists and administrators from Prince Edward Island. So I'll now introduce Ilse. She's a research master's student at the Faculty of Spatial Sciences at the University of Groningen. She holds a master's degree in human ecology from Lund University in Sweden, and, a bachelor's degree in cultural anthropology and development studies from Radboud University in the Netherlands. People will have an opportunity to ask questions after her presentation, either directly or via the chat, and we'll save that till the end. So I know that Ilse is ready to go. She has a presentation, and let's hope the technology does not fail us now, that we can have her share her screen, and I will ask you to take it away, Ilse.
Yes, thank you for that introduction. I'll try to share the PowerPoint.
It worked in the practice, so very good.
So hopefully you can all see that now.
Yep, looks great.
Yeah, so thank you for that introduction. As Laurie said, I haven't been able to travel to Prince Edward Island, but it's been an interesting and sort of unique way to get to know the island from a distance, but in this very specific topic. And I was very happy with the topic that we ended up selecting. I'm not an artist myself, but my mother is an artist, my sister is an artist. I've been brought up on the arts, and I'm very interested in climate change. So connecting those two of my main interests has been really wonderful. Yeah, so climate change has been a source of inspiration for artists for many years. And since the 1990s, there have been projects like Art Circulo and Cape Farewell, bringing artists and scientists together to work on climate change. But research on potential impacts of climate art is very limited and is commonly focused on public engagement. So the premise of this research is that art can have impacts from which climate change adaptation policies on Prince Edward Island can benefit. And I really wanted to see what those potential impacts were and how we can use them. So the choice for Prince Edward Island is, of course, because of my internship at the University of Prince Edward Island. But it makes really perfectly sense because Prince Edward Island is actively looking for adaptation opportunities. And it has a very vibrant artistic community that derives inspiration from the island's land and seascapes. So to further state, the aim of the study was to find a way to integrate art or artistic processes into the policymaking process of climate change adaptation on Prince Edward Island. And we developed together a few research questions that were the focus of this research. So the main question is, how can the power of art be harnessed for climate change adaptation policies on Prince Edward Island? To answer that question, I first needed to answer, what potential does art have to accomplish other goals? How are climate change adaptation policies made, and what challenges would policymakers welcome support on? And what would artists need to be able to work within a policy framework? So the research started with a literature review on climate change art, art in policy, and climate change adaptation. In addition, or actually as the main focus of the research, were semi-structured in-depth interviews with 11 people, but 10 interviews in total. One of them was with 2 people at the same time. These participants were found through search engines, governmental websites, personal contacts. I just searched essentially for every artist on Prince Edward Island and tried to contact them. But especially through a snowball method of contacts from Laurie and Ross, and then contacts from contacts, and so we went on. In the end, I ended up with 11 participants. There were 4 artists from Prince Edward Island, 1 artist that came from the United States with no connection to the island whatsoever, but he is very specifically working on climate art and contacted me, and he could offer some additional intel on what it means for climate artists to work. I spoke with 3 policymakers at province and municipal level, and 3 sort of cultural experts who could really share their insight in bringing artists together in other frameworks. As a data analysis, I transcribed all the interviews, and I used Atlas TI to inductively code all the interviews. So the insight from all these different people was really necessary to create a framework for integrating art into Prince Edward Island's climate change adaptation policies that takes into account what is workable for both sides. So I really wanted to make it as practical as possible. So I'll start with some of the findings from my literature review. First of all, on the topic of art and climate change. As I said before, there have been several projects bringing art and artists and scientists together, such as Cape Farewell, Tipping Point, Art Circulo. And I think probably Cape Farewell is the most well-known example of this. Their goal was to really communicate climate change realities through art. So art was really a visual technique of bringing climate change impacts that were already that people were already experiencing, to make them visual for people all over the world. They organized expeditions to Spitsbergen, where artists engaged with scientists and derived artistic inspiration from exposure to the world's climate tipping points, in the hopes that they were inspired to create art that could share that experience with the rest of the world. These expeditions have led to publications, a movie, and an educational packet called Extreme Environments. Another example is the German art collective Art Circulo, who had a similar approach of bringing artists and scientists together, but also included technologists and curators, and were specifically focused on the theme of water. They, in addition to in addition to starting a dialogue with the general public through the artworks that were created, they also used business methodologies to create products that could respond to climate change, such as the work Quell Systems by Peter Troutwijn, which would generate drinking water and could be used in times of water shortage. Then I also looked into the potential impacts that people see for climate art. And most of these, the most used argument for the value of climate change art is about the role it can play in climate change engagement. But there are many facets to this role. By accessing the imagination, people can envision different scenarios and what is needed to create a desirable future. So this really makes it possible to take perspective and think about what we need for a future that we want to live in. A very important aspect that is frequently mentioned is the possibility to experience data, because it can be difficult to comprehend for a non-scientist what it means when you look at climate change numbers. And but a collaboration between art and science can really create an immersive experience that can then provoke an emotional response. And that is something that science itself has struggled to achieve. Through this experience, people can engage with the subject and gain an increased understanding of the issue, and possibly an increased motivation to take action. But experiencing this data can also allow people to mentally prepare for the future and build up an emotional resilience to the challenges that lay ahead. However, there have also been concerns that the catastrophic representations of climate change that you can frequently see and messages of fear can lead to apathy rather than engagement. That is not to say that this sort of outshines the other possibilities for climate art. Because climate art can also facilitate dialogue, and this is especially true for participatory arts practices, because they can establish more direct linkages between people, climate art, and the local context in which they make sense of climate change. Furthermore, and this is actually the most important part for my study, is that art can stimulate creative thinking. This is a very sort of under-researched area for climate art, but it is incredibly important. Art can stimulate a different way of thinking, be more critical, but also more creative. And this can open up people to the various sides of the issue and to new evidence. The creative approach can also help people to overcome the barrier of the complexities and the unknowns of climate change. A second sort of subtopic for the literature review was art and policy, to see what is already being done with the potential that art has. Unfortunately, there are very few examples available. That is not to say that they aren't there. It's quite possible that in specific locations, people are using artistic practices for policy making or policy implementation. But these are not very visible and don't seem to be a topic in research. But there can still, some inspiration can still be gained from cultural policies that govern arts funding or public arts policies. So some sort of recommendations from those studies that do exist are that art can never reach its full potential if it's in a subordinate position to the rest of the policies. It needs to be fully integrated. And not be used solely as a visual aid to make something known. On the topic of public art, there were also some recommendations that could be applied to this topic. There is a very high variation in the commitment to policies on public art. And it's often just when it's sort of convenient that they use these policies. But Pollock and Pattison, they advise that for public art policies, they need to create mutually beneficial relationships, and it shouldn't be just incidental implementation. They also argue there's a big challenge to develop an institutional structure for public art that still offers enough flexibility for an artist to work with. And this is, of course, something that I needed to consider in this study as well. Furthermore, they discuss the topic of participatory public art, in which it's very important to consider who actually gets to participate. And there is another example of study that uses arts practices for social inclusion. But it's very, they evaluate, in this study, they evaluate the success of a policy that tried to do this. But it was very difficult to evaluate this because it was unclear what is considered successful. If the end result doesn't have sort of artistic value, is it still a successful project? Or if it's an artistic value that you end up with, but it didn't actually help for social inclusion, is the project successful? So it's important to consider beforehand what is meant by success in this case. Another study specifically discusses the importance of realignment of art and science in relation to politics, because this can lead to a more innovative approach to climate change. There's still often a very big disconnect between science, but also between arts and the implementation side on policymaking. Finally, the literature review also looked at climate change adaptation, and especially on things that might require more attention. Through this part of the literature review, I found that the focus is often very much on the engineering solutions for securing the built environment to make our world safe to live in. But they often overlook or simply just don't pay enough attention to the social or cultural implications of climate change and adaptation. There is a growing attention for flexible adaptive systems to deal with climate change uncertainties. And this could actually be a good sort of entry point for the arts, because the art is not about certainty. Several authors discussed that there is more attention needed for the societal ramifications and the role of the community in adaptation. There is also a need for transformational thinking, again, something that the arts excel at. And finally, there's a need for socio-ecological planning for climate resilience. And the study that refers to this specifically, they also discuss opportunities there are for co-design or having community input in the design of climate resilience. And this is supported by a creative approach. So I'll move on to the interview findings now. I've divided them in several themes again, and I started with the theme of climate change adaptation concerns. This was included to identify issues that could be supported by including arts practices in adaptation, with a focus on what people thought might be missing on Prince Edward Island, or Prince Edward Island in particular was at risk of. But of course, these are also applicable to other locations. A main concern was about engaging the public. The people are still, they might be aware of it, but they're not fully engaged in discussing the issue and working on solutions. An issue specifically mentioned by policymakers is the need to establish buy-in in other departments and in the public sphere. Because it's not only the climate action department that needs to develop these policies. These policies need to be developed at very different sectors that all need to be involved. Another issue is the need to create a sense of urgency, people still often see climate change as something for the future, while we're actually already experiencing the consequences of climate change. Then there is a need to stimulate a more long-term perspective on climate change, and just in general, really, to really think about the longer process of adaptation and the consequences of climate change if we don't make changes now. Really interesting quote that I would like to share with you. I'll just read it to you, although you can read it yourself as well. This is a quote from Jason. This is a pseudonym that I used. He was a cultural expert on Prince Edward Island. I think the thing that's interesting about climate change is the idea that there really isn't any going back. It's going to happen. It isn't going to happen at kind of a steady pace, but it's going to happen in an exorable pace, and it will be a sort of slow motion disaster. And I think that's a hard thing for people to get their heads around. It's like, even if you're sort of disaster aware, you're sort of disaster aware not on that weather scale as opposed to a climate scale. So people know that climate change is an issue, but a lot of sort of direct impacts that we can already experience are seen as sort of isolated events rather than part of this longer term perspective of structural changes. There are several participants who expressed concerns about competing economic interests on Prince Edward Island, specifically from the agricultural sector and the tourism sectors, with a specific focus on the cruise ships that require a tremendous amount of water, of which Prince Edward Island's supply is limited, and will be further impacted by climate change as well. Finally, the policymakers that I spoke with would specifically appreciate support on the setting of priorities in adaptation policies. They specifically noted that it's not practically possible to work on all the needed solutions at the same time. So they need others to be involved in deciding what should be done first. And again, for this, it's really important to have the necessary buy-in at other departments as well. Right, water. And to move on to the next topic in the interviews, the potential that people see for art to contribute to climate change, but also just in general, potential that art has to have additional impacts beyond its artistic value. Again, here, the main sort of impact that was raised in the interviews is the supportive engagement, because art can invoke an emotional response, and it can help process difficult information and difficult emotions. Sorry, just losing my notes. Many of the participants that I spoke with believe that many people avoid the issue of climate change because it's simply too overwhelming, and they don't know how to deal with the daunting reality of it. But using art for engagement and invoking these emotional responses, it forces people to deal with the reality. But it can also help them to process the difficulties. It can both confront and comfort people, and this balance especially is really important. As Maria, cultural expert, said, there's really political aggressive art that wants you to have a very strong reaction, but then there's this gentle beauty, and I guess it says two things. There's like art can point out what's wrong, and art can show you a vision of the way the world could be, and maybe it can do both at the same time. The participants that I spoke with, they did see value in this confrontational art because it forces people to think. But they also felt a need for climate art to be more nuanced and have more positive messaging. Some of the participants specifically discussed the issues of climate grief, and they believe that art can help because people can gain a sense of recognition and feel less alone in their experience. It can, to further discuss the potential for engagement, it can reach people on an emotional level, and this sort of, sorry, by reaching people on an emotional level, climate art can also lead to engagement because it increases people's understanding of the problem. It makes the information that they are faced with more digestible, and people can really experience the intangible reality of climate change, and which is then made more tangible for people to experience. It can also increase the potential for creative thinking, which can support the creation of solutions for adaptation. And the policymakers here in particular remarked that it's easy to overlook opportunities and to get stuck in a routine of how it's always been done. But for climate change adaptation, there is no how it's always been done because everything has to still be developed. The participants really believe that these creative processes can break through that barrier and to allow fresh ideas to be developed. As Max, the US artist, said, art can support by allowing people to think otherwise, not thinking the same way all the time. Artists are really valuable for that. Maybe it's time for our leadership to acknowledge that it doesn't know what it's doing. It's locked into patterns that don't work in this context. So what does it need more than anything? It needs different ideas. They could be wrong ideas or failures, but they're different. And that's actually essential at this moment in history, I think. We really need to still develop the possible solutions through this to this problem that we're facing. So creativity is incredibly important in this sense. And of course, the intent of this research was to find a way to integrate the arts into climate change adaptation policies. Participants were asked what possibilities and restrictions they perceived for bringing art and policy together. In addition, they were asked for their opinions on 2 preconceived concepts and 1 concept that was suggested in the first interview by the participant. So these ideas, you can see them on the screen. The first one is to bring artists and policymakers together and to have them work in a creative setting on issues that policymakers are struggling with. So sort of co-creating between artists and policymakers. One of the concerns that was expressed for this is that they are sort of speaking 2 different languages. They have a very different style of working. And this can be valuable because it forces them to think in a different way. But it's also a challenge to really work together. Therefore, it's really important to ensure that there's equal footing for everyone involved and there's a neutral space for collaboration. That this was really seen as crucial for establishing equality between artists and policymakers. The second idea is to use participatory arts practices in which artists work with community members to co-create an artwork in which they give input to policies. Of course, there are already sort of input sessions organized by governmental agencies. But the policymakers that I spoke with, they also expressed that they are sort of struggling to really bring in a variety of people, and that's sort of the middle is often missed in these input sessions. And the idea here is that an artistic approach can make it easier for people without an active interest in the topic to still contribute. That you don't have to be an expert to share your input, because it's really, everyone should have something to say about adaptation policies, because it's about what you think is important to protect for the future. And using this artistic approach can sort of lower the threshold for people to participate in input sessions, especially for people who might not find the right words to describe what they are experiencing. A concern for this particular idea is that people really need to see that the input is taken seriously. They need to see that something is being done with what they share, and it's not just sort of sticker that policymakers get that they have organized this and they have gained input, but then don't actually implement the input. So it was expressed that it's really important that policymakers themselves are also participating in this co-creation, and they're not just sitting there and watching. The final idea was suggested by Jason, who was a cultural expert, in order to overcome the differences in approach and time frame between policymakers and artists. This idea is to establish an artist in residence position at the Climate Action Department, or whatever governmental department is relevant, where an artist is working on climate change adaptation as an artistic subject, and where policymakers can walk in and walk out of the studio. This way, the artist can work in its own, in their own time frame, and just do what they do best. But policymakers can be inspired by having this context of art around them. Concerns that were expressed regarding this idea is that it's too casual. And it's really important to stimulate the interaction between the two sides, because otherwise you're not really gaining the potential that it's been designed for. So in this case, it would be really important to organize regular activities such as workshops, discussions, walks, and things like that to make sure it's used to its full potential. To successfully implement this concept, there are several things to take into consideration. There needs to be a balance between a clear structure that is understandable for everyone involved, but also flexibility and freedom that allows for creativity and artistic expression. The artists would need access to the right materials, not only artistic materials, but also access to policies that are still in development, so they can really work on something that is relevant for the policymakers. In all activities, there needs to be equal footing between the participants, so that everyone feels comfortable sharing and contributing to the process. In addition, it's really important to have a clear intent for the activity that needs to be I lost my train of thought, sorry. There needs to be a clear intent from the start, so everyone sort of has their noses in the same direction and knows what they're working towards. In the community input sessions, particularly, it's important that policymakers and government representatives are participating together, because people are more inclined to actively participate if they really believe that something will be done with their input. It is a challenge that has been expressed for policymakers themselves as well, to really get a cross-section of the community to participate in these activities. And that's also a reason that it's really important to make clear that everyone's voice matters, and that there is no need to be an expert on the topic at hand. So think I've covered all of these. Yeah, so some of the other final considerations for the integration are that policymakers would specifically welcome public help on a prioritization of their adaptation efforts. So this is a topic that would really work with the second idea of community input. Not every artist has the skills to really collaborate with policymakers and the public in this way. But some of my participants expressed that the artists would sort of filter themselves out already. These three concepts for integration, they're not mutually exclusive. And it was expressed by several participants that a combination of the three would actually work best. And then finally, there really needs to be sort of neutrality in space, but this space does need to facilitate creative processes. I was also expressed by some participants that it should be open not only to policymakers, but also to the public to visit the artists and see what they're working on. So the final concept is really based on the potential that artists, policymakers, and cultural experts identified for art to contribute to the development of climate change adaptation policies. It is impossible to state with certainty the effect it will have in practice without a trial implementation. However, the findings suggest that there are opportunities which are worthwhile to pursue. Interest in the research concept clearly exists on Prince Edward Island, in combination with a relatively small population and the active work in climate change adaptation. This would make Prince Edward Island an excellent testing ground for the integration of art into adaptation. So these are just my references. And thank you for listening. Thank you to my participants for sharing their insights. And of course, thank you to Ross and Laurie for making it possible for me to do this research.
Great, thank you, Ilse. That was lovely. And the recommendations coming out at the end are really amazing because they are things that can happen, right? They could if we can make them happen. And I think there's some really wonderful people that have been brought into this project to be thinking about this. And I would love to see if it's possible, you know, to have some follow-up. So yeah, bravo. Thank you so much. Yay. So this is a point where I would love to open it up for questions. If anybody would like to ask Ilse a question or make a comment, I would welcome that very much. We have about 10 minutes left, maybe 12 minutes left before the end of the Zoom call. So please, if you'd like to pop anything in the chat, you're welcome to do that as well if you don't want to actually turn on your camera or your mic and ask it in person. So, and you can use the raise hand function if you like, or just turn off your microphone and I will see you.
Well, thank you, Ilse. That was really neat. Very thoughtful and creative. Yeah, I can well imagine on an island our size that we have the potential to follow some of these recommendations. And no, I'm just imagining, you know, the provincial government buildings downtown with artists in residence. That would be terrific. And not least of all, because you would also attract members of the public in to connect with the artists of residence. And in so doing, they might connect with the bureaucrats who govern their futures, which would be salutary, because mostly they get to connect with people who maybe are not working for the public interest so much.
Thank you, Irene. Those are really good comments. And I can see that happening at one of the provincial government buildings already. Just picture it in my mind's eye. I love it. Ilse, do you know if in your research, are places doing this in other realms, not necessarily climate change adaptation, but where there actually are artists in residence that do this kind of thing that we might look at?
I haven't found specifically sort of policy making that works in this way, or a governmental institute that has this artist in residence program. There might be somewhere in the world. Of course, there was an artist in residence at the climate department in the Climate Sense program as well. So I think that was really great, and to really work with scientists as well in this way, and have a structured way of doing this. And I know that she was also in contact with some more policy departments as well. But as far as I know, there hasn't been an artist in residence specifically in a governmental position.
Right. Okay. I have a question from Catherine. So was the study looking at primarily visual art?
I didn't really have a particular focus. I think the artists that I spoke with were primarily working in visual arts, although the one from the US was actually working with music. And really wonderful music that I wish I could share, but I kept anonymity, so that's difficult. So, and I didn't really have a particular focus, and I think really any type of artwork can have similar impacts in this sense.
Lovely. Shayna, you have popped into the chat that's talking about role playing as being a very useful way of interacting between artists and policymakers. So role playing games, and thank you for creating that link in the role playing games used in community disaster preparedness, which is really interesting. And Catherine, you mentioned that you've done role playing in some of your work as well. So did you come across anything like that, Ilse?
No, I don't think I have. It looks really interesting, so I will look into that.
Yeah,
I think I can really imagine how much that works. And I did find, like, for participatory arts, they did discuss also the particular potential of more theater work. So that is, in a sense, I suppose, role playing as well. But especially just not only theater, but also dance, and really having this embodied experience that is really, really valuable.
Lovely. Shayna, would you like to add anything?
It got me thinking when someone I think Catherine mentioned visual art. So the most riveting part in my growing up time was when Inconvenient Truth came out, and the power of using cinema, as an art form, because it can transcend geographical boundaries in another scale. So I think, you've just got the tip of the iceberg, so to say, with art. There's just so many possibilities to look at.
Yes, absolutely. I know I came across several examples of artworks that I wish I could have experienced myself, but stupid COVID. There was, I remember an example, I think it was somewhere in the UK, of an installation working primarily with sound that would be a sort of audio visual, like, what's the opposite of visualization? Like a representation of climate data, but through sound, in a space where you could walk through, and you could. It wasn't exactly the sound of melting ice caps, but it was. So there were comments from scientists who had experienced this space, and they really were impressed, because it's it shared exactly the feeling that they got when they were doing their science. And that's something I think that is really incredible, and to really have this full embodied experience by moving through a space and having not only the visual representation, but audio as well, and really using all the senses, making it also possible for many more people to experience the work.
Thank you. Jim, you had your hand up there, and then Ross after that.
Sure. Thanks, Elsa. I actually sort of had that question about what kind of art form as well. And the reason I was thinking of that is that I had a project many years ago when I was at a University of Saskatchewan, where we had, after we had finished both the qualitative and the quantitative research that we had done on measuring indicators of quality of life, and before we had a large sort of community-based meeting to discuss the results, we actually hired a theater troupe, a small local theater troupe, and we gave them the 3 different main findings of the research. And so they came up with a short skit of 3 to 4 minutes for each one of those 3 themes in order to better communicate, engage with the community audience than if it was a typical academic PowerPoint presentation. And it was very effective. But so I guess that was effective, but I guess from what I've just listened to you, that would not necessarily be a very integrative thing, because that would be hiring artists after the fact to communicate with people rather than having them part of the research right up front.
Yes, I see an incredible potential for this type of engagement as well. But it was a choice that I made in this research because it's overlooked, to really focus on sort of the beginnings of policies and the creation of policies rather than the communication afterwards. But that is not to say that it shouldn't be included there, but there's already more attention for that sort of area. But I think it could be combined as well, to have this artist in residence position and having policymakers come to the artist with ideas that they are struggling with for policy making, but also for ideas that are finished, and how can we communicate this to the public for implementation.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks. Ross, would you like to speak up?
Yeah, thank you very much. I just thanks, Ilse, for such a great presentation. It really does get us thinking. And I just wanted to point out really how useful this kind of research is. Ilse's paper has really informed next steps that we're taking within the Climate Sense project regarding our climate intern that Ilse mentioned there, in exactly this way of looking at an artist in residence, possibly or potentially up at the new center in St. Peter's. There's a gallery space there. There's an opportunity to connect with community there, and there's an opportunity to be directly engaged in the research that's taking place both in Parks Canada, in the park associated with the center, and in the general community. So, this is a little piece of master's work, but potentially has a huge opportunity to show the relevance and the value of implementing one of these potential possibilities. So, just congratulations and thank you on such great work. And it's not, it's certainly not going to waste. This is something we're going to be using when we forward this to the province in the coming weeks. So, congratulations.
Thank you.
Lovely, Ross. Thank you. You probably noticed in the chat that Megan added about temperature quilts that people are making. There was a woman on the news last week who had crocheted a blanket with the 365 days, different colors for the temperatures, and it was quite effective. And I can imagine, it's a very community-oriented thing that anybody could undertake, and it was very visual, and also, you could curl up in it. Irene.
Yeah. Were any of the policymakers that you spoke to arts funders? I guess I don't know if they qualify as being policymakers, but they certainly have an influence on what the arts get engaged with.
I included her as a cultural expert who was a policymaker. I think it was at provincial level, But I decided to include her as a cultural expert rather than the policymaker. Really, the policymakers were specifically focused on climate change adaptation. But it was very helpful as well because they have experience in working with artists in various settings.
Because I'm thinking of Art in the Open, which is an annual festival in Charlottetown, which has a tremendous public impact. You know, I mean, everybody goes to it, and it's outdoors. it's often very much triggers emotions of connection, community connection, connection with nature, connection with art, and the interconnections, and also intimations of disaster. Remember the car dangling over the dining table. Yeah, but to encourage artists to bend their mind and their creative instincts towards the issues around climate change, it often helps to have supportive funding from government. So that's kind of a policy, and that's a policy, whether to do that or not.
No, definitely, and that's definitely a requirement for artists to work on this. That was also mentioned repeatedly, the need for funding. And that's, I think, why this artist in residence program would be so wonderful to create, because it gives the artists a sense of security and allows them to work in whatever way they want. But they have this sense of security of being supported, but still have freedom to work with it. And yes, Art in the Open and River Clyde pageants, I think they were both mentioned in essentially every interview. But I felt it was really kind of a shame that the work that is being done there is not really, as far as I can tell, and as far as I heard from participants, it's not really used for input in policies. Well, it's still there. They're wonderful activities, and I've been looking at their websites online and videos that were made. And it's such a shame that this potential that there is going to waste.
So how would you imagine that happening? How would those connections be made, Ilse? If you had any light bulbs go off while you're fossicking through your
I think
research files and references?
I think it doesn't have to be very complicated in that sense.
No, especially on a small island.
Policymakers are already going to these events, but they're going as just a regular citizen going to these events because everyone goes there. But you can create partnerships with organization to maybe organize together a specific workshop or table or whatever fits with the festival, to gather input, and people are already walking by because they are going to the festival, so you have a wide variety of people that are there. And you just need to sort of provide a structure where they can give input in a creative way and have this contact with policymakers that they are actually using that input. And this creative setting of the festival, it gives people so many ideas, and really, it opens up your mind to think in a different way and to just have a specific location within that setting where you can express those ideas that you gain to policymakers, and policymakers can express their ideas that they are gaining, and really just making notes of it and using it. And I think that's already just a wonderful first step to take.
And I'm thinking often if you have a book, you might create a reader's guide to go with it, or a teacher's guide. Perhaps there's something that we could do here that could create to put some of these ideas down that policymakers could use as a guide, and the organization too, to bring them together. So it's just a little idea that might be another intermediary step to bring them together. So anyway. Well, we've reached our time, and I would like to thank you all for coming. I'm going to ask Megan to come on and to formally thank Ilse. There she is.
Thank you, Ilse, for your enlightening presentation, and thank you, Ross, for joining us today. And thanks as well to everyone in the audience that came to join us today and participate in the discussion. If you'd like to be the first to know about future webinars in our Island Lecture Series and other latest Island Studies news, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter at islandstudies.com/newsletters. And keep an eye out for the confirmation email that you will receive afterwards. I hope you all had a great time and have a lovely day.
Wonderful. Thanks, Megan. And generally at the end of a lecture, we will give a gift to our speaker. And because you are across the ocean, I will put this in the mail to you. This is a copy of Jim Randall's book, An Introduction to Island Studies, and it will come in a Prince Edward Island potato bag. And I will also include a copy of my book, which is an integration of art, using art to teach about island studies as well. So I hope that you enjoy them, and they might get to you in a couple of months, knowing the postal system. But
Thank you. I will look forward to it.
okay, I'll have to get your email address by email. Thanks again, everyone, and really appreciate the work you've done, Ilse, and it's just been such a pleasure working with you. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.